So we'll make a start. Welcome everyone in the live audience as well as online. I'm Jocelyn McPhee. I'm the president of the Royal Society of Tasmania, and I'm also a fellow of the Academy of Technology and Engineering. So my welcome is on behalf of those two organisations which have brought you this event this evening. The Royal Society of Tasmania and the Academy of Technology and Engineering acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people, and the ongoing custodianship of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. We pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that Tasmanian Aboriginal people have survived severe and unjust impacts resulting from invasion and dispossession of their country. We recognise Aboriginal cultural knowledge and practices and seek to respect and honour these traditions and the deep understanding that they represent. Now, I've just mentioned that this event is brought to you by the Royal Society of Tasmania and the Academy of Technology and Engineering, but chances are that most of you won't know much about both organisations, and most of you might only know a little bit about one or none. So I'm just going to spend 2 minutes explaining a little bit about those organisations. The Royal Society of Tasmania is an organisation devoted to the advancement of knowledge. So very broad interest in learning and scholarship. And we attempt to achieve our aim to advance knowledge through regular events like this, so public lectures, and also we publish a journal, the Papers and Proceedings of the Royal Society of Tasmania. We also publish scholarly books about history and art and various other topics, and we offer medals and awards to outstanding scholars every year. We also own a unique art collection presently housed at TMAG, and a similarly unique book of library of special and rare books, which is housed here at the University of Tasmania. And those two collections are a very important resource for scholarship. The Academy is also about learning and research, but very much in the applied arena, and in particular applied science and technology and engineering. The Academy tries to meet its mission by having outreach events like this, as well as providing expert opinion to government on major issues facing all of us, such as climate change and problems with food security and energy security and infrastructure, very long list. But the overall approach is to try to harness what our modern technology can offer to solve some of these complex problems. So there's a lot of overlap between the organisation, and we every so often collaborate to bring public events like tonight's to the fore. So tonight is all about the oceans, and in particular the potential for the oceans to provide some of what our modern lives demands, particularly in the biological arena. And at this point, it's appropriate for me to hand over to my colleague, John Gunn. John is also a fellow of the Academy, and he's actually the chair of the Tasmanian division of the Academy. And just to provide a little bit more background about John, he's been very active in the science behind the sustainable use of marine ecosystems and resources for over 35 years. He's held the position of Chief Executive of the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences, He's been Chief Scientist of the Australian Antarctic Program and Deputy Chief of CSIRO's Marine and Atmospheric Research Division. He's worked at that boundary between research and development and industry throughout his career. He chairs the boards of the Marine Bioproducts Cooperative Research Centre and Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System. He's also a non-executive director of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. So we had actually planned that John would simply provide an introduction to the main presentations tonight, but one of our speakers, Justin Coombs, couldn't join us. He was coming to us from Adelaide, but he has COVID and couldn't travel. And he's also sufficiently sick that he hasn't been able to present online, but he will join us during the Q&A session later on. So I will now, with great pleasure, introduce John. I'm going to go down, I'm going to go up. That one.
Look down at the screen. So hello everyone and welcome to the Royal Society and ATSI joint do. This is the first that I've ever attended, I'm ashamed to admit. It's a cold evening in Hobart today and it's raining outside, so thank you very, very much for coming out tonight, and thanks to the people who are sitting online somewhere. I don't know how many of them there are. You can try and raise that for me, that'd be great. Gone down now. Oh, you beauty. That'll do me. Thanks very much. As you've just heard, Justin Coombs can't make it tonight, but I am going to introduce him. We were going to be a quartet, we're now a trio. We're competing with the Festival of Voices tonight, apparently, as well in Hobart. So this trio consists of Katrina McLeod, who's currently, I think, interim director of the UTAS Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies. And she's also a program leader of the new Marine Bioproducts CRC. She's worked extensively for and with the aquaculture industry over, I won't say many years, for a long time, and has an international reputation for her research into aquaculture. Over recent years, she's had a particular focus on the culture of seaweeds, and she'll include that in her presentation tonight. Paul Garrett is very welcome here. Paul is Managing Director of the Tasmanian biotech company Marinova. This rapidly growing local enterprise is a world leader in the production of high quality and high value products from seaweeds, and you'll hear more from him about that. When I first met Paul, tried to sell him on the idea of being part of this CRC that I now chair. He told me that his company had a principle, and I forget whether it was 25%, but it was a high number, a percentage of the turnover of Marinova from day one was spent on R&D. I think the company's gone an order of magnitude higher in terms of productivity and the like, and yet that principle is still something that Paul and the company have adhered to. Wouldn't it be great if Australia's companies, both startups and more advanced, did that type of continuity of contributions into a research base? I will, although he's not here, you will see him up on the screen. We were worried he's going to have his head in the middle of a screen behind three of us in the seats. I will introduce Justin. He's the CEO of the Marine Bioproducts CRC. He has a PhD and postdoctoral qualifications in biotech. And believe it or not, he's also a patent attorney. Apparently science just wasn't enough. He needed to go and do a patent attorney degree too. With this unique, I think pretty unique combination of skills and backgrounds, he's played a large number of senior roles in CRCs and in startups. And since 2021, he's been doing a fantastic, and it's a difficult job, so he's done a fantastic job at starting up a CRC. We got our money in July 2021, and we're up and running already, as you'll see in the slides going forward. To set the context for what we're doing, sorry, that was meant to be there earlier on. To set the context for this, I thought I'd run through a little bit of history. We call ourselves, the marine bioproducts world calls themselves the third generation of marine bio industries. When I was a young lad at university at James Cook, I wrote a paper in one of my third-year courses titled "The Future of Aquaculture in Australia." This was the I don't want to say it, late 1970s, early 1980s, and we were a fishing nation then. We had a growing fishing industry. By 1990, yes, 30 years ago, 1992, we had a total value of fisheries in the world of about $76 billion. I've got a little caption on the bottom of that. There were 5.5 billion people in the world at that time. Over that decade, the 90s, people all around the world, including Australians, started to recognise that this inexhaustible fishery resource was being severely depleted, and in fact, in many cases, were beyond being able to be harvested. And we had this idea that, well, we must replace the food for our 5.5 billion people with an aquaculture industry, and a lot of research dollars were spent all around the world in producing fish in captivity. The fish today, 8 billion people in the world today are increasingly being provided by aquaculture. Australia was among the nations that invested heavily. And in fact, there were 3 cooperative research centres focused on aquaculture. A number of people in the audience were part of that, of those CRCs, focused on growing Australia's aquaculture industry. Today, aquaculture is certainly still growing, but it's facing a growing number of pressures on a lot of fronts. Supply of foods, social licence, as we like to call it in academia these days, a social licence to operate for aquaculture, not just in Tasmania, but all around the world, is putting some serious pressures on that industry. So with the spectre of feeding, and I think we're talking about 10 billion by 2035 by my Google link today, we've got the spectre of overexploited or fully exploited fisheries and an aquaculture industry that is unlikely to expand enough to grow, to feed and to provide nutrients for a $10 billion industry. About 10 years ago, many people in Europe, lots of people in China and in North America decided that they should really look to another source of foods from the oceans in the form of a bioproducts industry. So rather than feeding people directly from wild caught or aquaculture, we would produce proteins, omega-3 oils, nutrition from the oceans in a much more industrial way. The marine bioproducts industry, the third generation of marine bioindustries, was born. Australia's been pretty slow, although there are again people in the audience and people in Hobart especially, CSIRO and UTAS were doing fantastic research in the sort of the background to this type of industry even 30 years ago. Australia's been very slow to realise the potential and to invest in this. And so today's talk's really about where we're at now and where we're going as much as how we're actually doing in a global race to try and provide food for 10 billion people, plus a whole range of other industries. Our answer, a group of us, a group of people who both in research and industry have invested in this quite heavily over the last decade, was to put a proposal in for a CRC, a Cooperative Research Centre, recently. And Justin Coombs, as I've said, is the CEO and was going to give this talk. You're just going to have to forgive me. I'll give it for him, and I hope I can do it justice, Justin. I don't think in this audience, in a town where marine industries are very, very strong, I need to talk about the potential of Australia's exclusive economic zone. The third biggest in the world, and that doesn't count the Southern Ocean territory that we claim. We've got a coastline that is in fact underexplored, let alone underexploited. And we have a biodiversity that's both unique and incredibly diverse. The north-south movement of biodiversity in the oceans will be a problem for species in Tasmania because there's nowhere to go. But many of the species that we're finding on Tasmania shores now came from New South Wales. So we have this tropical to temperate divide that gives us some hope that, in fact, regardless of how we go with carbon emissions reduction, we will have a very viable coastal ecosystem, marine ecosystems for a long, long time to come. The academics amongst us, and I think many industry players too, have seen what the drivers for building an industry are. And this slide's very complicated, but suffice to say that they're in three main areas: the sort of health and medical areas, the environmental and industrial spaces where perhaps bioremediation, or in fact, instead of sending plastics into the ocean, building new ways of making plastics biodegradable and sustainable plastic production are possible. Biofuels has obviously had a very major press and media coverage over the years, but still hasn't quite hit its straps. And in the agriculture and aquaculture sectors. The busy slide, I'm not going to go through it. There are many, many reasons why you should think about this as a way forward for a range of different applications in the world. The CRC, I know a number of you were involved in CRCs in your careers, the scientists amongst the room and engineers. The CRC, Marine Bioproducts CRC was first bid about 3.5 years ago, and we finally got up last year. It brings together 70 partners, quite a large CRC, from industry and academia, and in fact from marketing areas, from the markets for bioproducts as well, into a hub that's focused on a whole range of applications. We have set ourselves up to be a one-stop shop and not an exclusive one-stop shop. We are still hoping people will join the CRC as we hopefully become successful. The government provided us $59 million for our endeavours, and with co-funding from our partners, we have about $270 million to invest at the moment over the 10-year journey. Australia has to develop a full supply chain of value and supply chain for this industry to be successful. So rather than importing, as some companies in the room have to do occasionally, import materials in to then do a manufacturing process and develop a product. The CRC has set itself up to be both helping the primary producers, the advanced manufacturing sector, chemical advanced manufacturing, and the product developers. Many of the product developers, as you'll hear from Paul, interested not just in developing new products, but proving how efficient they are, effective they are in the targets that we're trying to set. Quite clearly, when you sell a CRC, you've got to sell it. It's going to be very, very important. And so we have a fledgling industry in Australia. Our main goal is to make sure that Australia has a competitive, and I think very successfully supported by R&D industry that will be competitive in a market that's going to be worth $700 billion. $700 billion, and some people say that's a conservative estimate, by 2035. By our own estimates, the CRC program makes you do an economic analysis. If we hit about median levels of our ambitions, this industry will be worth $1.5 billion by 2035. Aquaculture will probably be worth about $4 billion at that same time. So this will be a major additional industry in the marine sector for Australia, all going well. The government thinks about economies. We, in fashioning our CRC, thought very much about many more of the social elements of this. Growing seaweeds and microalgae and sea urchins and sea cucumbers will be a coastal cities and towns form of industry. Tasmania is very, very well placed to be at the centre of that. But so is Northern Australia. Our First Nations people own 95% of the coastline of Northern Australia, have claims on it. Currently, they make very, very little out of that. There is huge potential for those primary industry bases for a major production house in Australia for marine bioproducts to be based on those types of countries. We've had very major companies, 3 or 4 of the world's biggest chemistry companies, coming to us saying, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we would have kept on going with our synthetic products. Our customers are saying we don't want any more of that. We want nature-based solutions. They're investing in these types of, if you like, clean and green solutions for agricultural troubles. In regional Australia, and I probably still call Hobart a regional town, jobs is a really big thing. Throughout Victoria and South Australia and southern Western Australia, unemployment's very, very high. And so one of the things that I think this industry can provide is both employment through primary production, but if we go into smart manufacturing, have smart manufacturing based in this company, in this state, in those regions. Paul's company has proved that that's quite possible. One of the reasons that the state government invested in the CRC. They wanted to put money in, and I said, don't put it in until we're ready to start developing the industrial base for the CRC's products. We don't need more money into primary production and into smart chemistry. We need pilot plants and we need plants built. So the structure of the CRC, typically you have programs. The 3 programs are focused on 3 elements of the supply chain. The Sustainable Marine Resources program, which Katrina is going to talk about and leads. An innovative bioprocessing program. You'll hear about some very innovative bioprocessing that Marinova is doing a bit later. One of the holy grails of this industry is effectively being, well, not quite like the oil industry, but when you're in an oil refinery, you start with crude oil and you end up producing 10 or 15 different products from a very, very sophisticated biorefinery process or refinery process. In Finland and a couple of other European countries, they're on the cusp of being able to put in a species like Undaria that you're going to hear about later, putting an Undaria into a processing facility and get 5 or 6 species of products out of the same line. Profitability goes up enormously, a very intricate processing facility and high-level chemical engineering is required. But that's the type of breakthrough that would allow Australia to lead the world in terms of profitability. We need that. We're a high-cost employer in Australia, and we need that type of breakthrough. Program 2 will focus on that. And then we have a very large range of Australian marine bioproducts that are basically our industry partners want us to develop with them that will be produced at the same time. As I mentioned, we have a big opportunity here to train the next generation of aquaculturists and mariculturists and processing engineers, and we have a very strong CET program. Perhaps different from most CRCs, we also have an Indigenous element of that. We're unlikely to get a large number of PhDs out of the current range of graduates coming out of universities, but we are going to train, and then lead those pathways into university education for First Nations people in the CRC. The credit to Justin and his team. We've got a board that's pretty hard on them, but they've got off to a really fast start. A couple of CRCs that I know very well have taken 18 months to 2 years to get their first projects really up and running. Where I think we're about 8 months into the CRC and we've signed off on our firsts. I don't think I'll talk about it. It's a rough photograph, you're right. That's not you. I can see all the other guys, so not you. We've got a very good team. Some of you will know faces on the screen there. High caliber, very, very high caliber academics in their own rights. Some of them have actually turned from being, I think, classic academics, interested in the problem that they want to solve, not necessarily in where that's going to be taken up. They are absolutely 100% behind the idea that we are going to do projects that industry want us to do and that will be good for the industry. So I'm very pleased to see an excellent leadership team already in action. And this will be available for anybody who wants at the presentation. There's a range of projects that have already got started in this CRC, which I think everybody in the leadership team are very proud of, and the board's very happy with Katrina. And they include some seaweed extracts for human health, screening for novel agrochemicals. We've got one of the biggest German chemical manufacturers backing us. They just wanted projects to start the day one. And so we've already got those up and running. Some microalgae bioreactors, basically nurseries for seaweed are one of the absolute stoppers for a seaweed industry in Australia. There are many companies who want to grow seaweed. We're starting through the research program to support a seed production research line. And we're doing some seaweed cultivation for aquaculture, nutrient offsets as well. This is where seaweed can actually clean waters around salmon cage, I shouldn't have said salmon, aquaculture cages, and basically have a win-win. I'll come back to that later if I get a question about it. So if you'd like to know more, please ask a question later. If you're interested, and if anybody that you know might be interested, one of the really nice innovations early on is that the CRC website will have a magazine where we'll do some in-depth articles every month. So you can follow researchers, you can follow some of the industry partners as they explain what they're hoping to achieve. I think one of the first one's on Marinova, so we won't steal that thunder. The next one is around Signet Bay pearls. Some of you may know Signet Bay pearls, the biggest pearl manufacturer in Australia. They've joined the CRC because they had a problem. They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year cleaning their strings of pearl oysters, and when they pull it up, it happens to be a species of Asparagopsis, the methane busting seaweed that people are working on to try and turn into a methane busting industry. And they came to us to say, well, we'd like to be part of using that product that's cost us money to actually produce and put in a heap and turn it into something. So please follow that. And I was going to talk about your company, but I won't. I think at this stage, I'll leave it at that. Again, there'll be questions and answers later on. What I'd like to do now is invite Katrina to come to the stage and talk about her work.
Okay. Try that one. That's better. Yeah, much better. Thank you, John. I'm feeling a bit intimidated. You're right. I've been in a few CRCs in my life. Does this work, by the way? Okay. And I'm very conscious that the person who supported me in my very first really big research project is in the room, and he gave me a good critique on my first presentation. So maybe, John, you'll do that for me at the end of this one too. But a long time working in research around aquaculture and in collaborative research centres. And one of the things I particularly like about the MBCRC is it's actually it's a big CRC, but it's quite a small set of groupings. So the 3 programs, which are based around production, processing, and products, are all very interlinked. So there's no competition in there. We're all very dependent upon each other for success, and therefore it is truly a collaborative research centre. I've been in some really good ones of those, and I've been in some that are a little bit less so. So I'm really looking forward to where this one will go. They asked me to give a quick overview of the Tasmanian context and opportunities for and from Tasmania. Not specifically around the marine bioproducts, but CRC, but I will probably have a fair bias on that as John pointed out, program leader for program 1. But there's a few other things. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. If there's 2 ways to go, guarantee you go the wrong. So there's the Marine Bioproducts CRC, as John pointed out, is a very important one for underpinning the marine biotechnology industries around Australia. But it's not the only one. So there's a real hype and buzz around marine systems, the potential for marine systems, the blue economy. So alongside the Marine Bioproducts CRC, we have the Blue Economy CRC, which is based in UTAS and has a national and international focus. So the Blue Economy is looking at about 70 million federal funds came into that, 59 million into the MBCRC. There's a little less on the Seaweed Solutions CRCP. That's one I got up a few years ago, and in most people's books, 4 to 5 million would have been not a bad hit, but compared to the big hitters at the moment, is pretty trivial. But we're coming to the end of that CRCP. That's Tasmanian focused. It does have a seaweed focus around it, but it's around that. So how do we fit seaweed in with other aquaculture production to look at optimizing all of them. So this is the nutrient extraction associated with finfish aquaculture and bringing in some shellfish to try and look at some of the more particulate nutrient impacts. And that's possibly where I've come from in my background, is more around the sustainability side of things rather than the bioproducts. But I've got a long history of the production side of things. So merging those two together, I hope we're going to try in the CRC and in development of the marine bioproduct industry going forward to be much more focused on how do we do that sustainably and acknowledging right up front what some of the issues are and seeking to tackle them rather than shy away from them. The other one I've got listed up there is the Centre of Excellence for Aquaculture Futures. That again is one that is in the process of going through funding at the moment. But just in the sense that that's about another $40 million being asked for there, that's a significant amount of money in this marine biotechnology space, and a lot of research that will be undertaken in the next 10 years in this space. And one of the things we're going to work very hard on, and I think it's probably very important for science community as a whole, is to make sure that we don't duplicate effort. That's a lot of money, but there's a lot to be done. And so we're working quite hard to make sure that all of these initiatives are talking quite working quite closely together and partitioning what needs to be done into the right area, the right funding, the right partnership, so that we can get the best out of it. It's quite an ambitious ask to get a lot of scientists to work together like that, but we're going to have a red hot go. So in terms of what are the opportunities, John's touched on quite a few of these in terms of from byproduct opportunities and byproducts from the ocean. Probably the first thing that springs to mind is food products and food security. So there's a lot of stuff in there. John mentioned earlier, the Marine Bioproducts CRC covers a very broad range of products, but there's quite a strong emphasis in the seaweed and the microalgae space. And both of those sit quite heavily in the potential in the food products and food security. I mean, there's quite exciting things in that in terms of seaweed. Southeast Asia, it's really common, 200-300, well, certainly 200 species would be commonly used in food production. In Australia, you're probably looking at a dozen, maybe 20 if you're lucky, that we would commonly see in that sort of environment. So that's a huge potential market that we're untapped into. Some of it might be products that we have to socialize with the Australian community, that they have to get used to. But there's some other real potentials. Just as an example, with some of the marketing stuff that I was involved with in Canada, there's the opportunity for things like a frozen seaweed salad. That's the difference. It's green, it's crunchy, it's fresh, but you can freeze it. The market opportunity in that, in terms of distribution and shelf life availability, is huge and has not been tapped into. I'm not going to touch on the nutraceutical, cosmeceutical, and pharmaceutical section, because I think Paul's going to do a really good job of that from a Marinova perspective, and there's huge potential there, massive. One of the fallback positions we often have with things like seaweed production is if it's not great quality, we drop to fertilizers and foliar stimulants. That, as John says, can be really powerful because you have diversity in your product production, but it often looks at fertilizers and plant foods as a secondary level product, but that's not the case in many cases. In the MBCRC, we have some partners in there. That's their prime business, and they really want to optimize that. So there's some real potential in there. Innovative products. John touched on bioplastics. I know that's something that's being looked into, and it's also, we've got scientists here at UTAS that are looking into that space. Some really interesting challenges to overcome, but the potential is huge in that space. One of the other things that I was very excited about with a PhD student, again, that was associated with UTAS and Deakin University in this case, who went off looking at seaweeds as a potential building product, materials for pinboards, more of the aesthetic and the trying to get a high value product that people might engage with in a social sense. But some of the testing that was done on that showed this product to have very high fire retardant properties, which opened up a whole new gamut of opportunities that people hadn't really looked at. Sustainable investment, I've put that up there as an opportunity, because one of the things I've found since joining the MBCRC is just how much people want to get involved in this area. that there's, I have been in research for a very long time, but I've never seen as many people who want to find a way to connect with this, both scientists and investors. And being able to find a way to show people that this is a sustainable industry, or the opportunities for them to do something really good. And we've had quite a lot of interest from things like petroleum investors, mining and that sort of area, to look at, well, what are the opportunities for them to do something really innovative in this space. Probably in terms of media, there's been a lot of around the carbon reduction potential, particularly in the seaweed space. And whilst that's there, it still needs a little bit of research. The science still needs to be stacked up behind some of that to truly show the value of it, both in terms of things like carbon offsets and just the sheer quantum of what we're talking about here in carbon reductions. Some species better than others, and that's starting to emerge through the science we're doing right now, that it's not quite as clear cut as some. So mangroves, seagrasses probably have really much clearer carbon reduction benefits than some of the macroalgae species that we're looking at. So really understanding that is a critical science development area to know that when you're making claims or you're pursuing expansion around using carbon or even carbon trading or offset as a strategy, you need to know what you're doing. And we're getting a lot of government interest in undertaking some research to look at that. And the same applies in the nutrients, in offsets and management. That Seaweed Solutions CRC that I was looking at was very focused on integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, which is growing these species together to try and get a reduction in overall impact. And there's a lot of work still to be done around that to say, well, and what we're finding, I think, John, you'll know this from the Aquafin CRC days, is you can't grow it the same everywhere. The benefits are not the same everywhere. It's very place-based and it's very system-based. And I'll come to that in terms of the risks in a second. And then, of course, there's the untapped potential of many, many other products that we're starting to identify as we're working with the industries around what the potential is. One that came up to us the other day was some interest in things like oyster secretions and glues, and how that might be expanded further to look at what that is, not just in terms of whether you can actually utilize the products themselves, but also how you could use that as an analog for synthetic development. There are risks though, and we're conscious of that. And there's a lot of research that will underpin the risks to make sure that what we do is sustainable. We want to make sure that the investment, the money is put in the right places, and we don't get driven by purely the dollar. It has to be sustainable. Underpinning that, there's a lot of issues around governance, and we're looking at that extensively within the CRC as to how do you get access to water so that you can actually trial things, because in some areas it's really hard to do that. But also that when you do give people access to water, you understand what the implications are and the risks, and that the management is risk appropriate. There's a really big risk in a lot of these marine bioproduct space around the aquaculture capability. So Australia-wise, we're pretty well placed for this, but we don't have enough people, and that ties to John's comment about needing to. A key part of this is around the training aspect. So, for instance, in a lot of the seaweed development side of things, the people who are actually coming on to help with the aquaculture development are those with skills in ecophysiology and ecology. So they're not actually trained in the aquaculture side of things. So there's a lot of transition of skills that needs to happen in there moving forward. Biosecurity is always going to be an issue. We're looking at mass production of species within an area, whether they're endemic. For the most part, fortunately, at the moment, most of the species we're looking at are endemic, with the one notable exception. I'll come to that in a second. But there is still issues around the biosecurity of the species you're growing, and then the potential impacts on those. These are new species. A lot of things that we're starting to grow, we might not, we can find unexpected biosecurity risks. So we need to be mindful of that. Nutrient limitations, particularly with seaweed. I'm very conscious. The waters around Australia are, well, especially around Tasmania, but yeah, most of Australia are quite low in nutrients compared to the Northern Hemisphere. So looking at mass production of seaweeds can be quite challenging in some cases. So we have to take that into account, not just in our site selection and placement in our species selection, but in terms of our genetic programs when we start to look at breeding these species to optimize growth and production. Sustainability as a whole is fully embedded, and we were very aware of that from the moment we set the CRC up, that this is going to be an issue we have to explicitly address. It's not just something you add on, we're taking it on front and center. Alongside that is social license, and I've actually separated them because sustainability is something we need to undertake for the benefit of the producers and making sure that you farm the right thing in the right place. But the social and cultural license is a broader how we engage with the community, stakeholders, government, and the Indigenous population. And as John mentioned, Justin, as an IP lawyer, it's one of the things we've been really keen to look at in this is what is the Indigenous IP in some of the production that we're looking at. Elsewhere in the world, they've tackled that in different ways through the Canadian First Nations and the iwi in New Zealand, and we're working quite closely with them to try and, or we're hoping to work quite closely with them to try and share knowledge across that and get this right as it goes forward. And then the last one is that area that is a risk is the markets and competition, that we drive behind something that we haven't done due diligence. Is there a market out there in the first place? Who is our competition? Are we setting ourselves up to fail? So having a good idea about what something can be only works if the market wants it. And that's another one of the circular part of the MBCRC means that we've got that fully embedded in all our thinking, that we're not setting ourselves up to fail. So the opportunities for Tassie specifically, I think we're really set up in a really good space for this. We have a quantum of marine science in this in Tasmania that's second to none, and scientists with expertise and skills in the area we need, in fisheries and aquaculture, in primary industry innovation, in governance and IMTA, but also in the chemistry, in the physics, in the production development, tying into the blue economy, perhaps in some of those incredibly interesting advances they're making around renewables. That is all based here in Tasmania, and we can take advantage of it. The other one is the seaweeds we've actually got. So at risk of emphasizing seaweeds a lot, we have Asparagopsis down here, and just in case you don't know, that's the one John says is showing such promise in terms of methane reduction in ruminants, so cattle and sheep, and real potential there. Asparagopsis is endemic to Australia, so that is a really big advantage, because in the rest of the world, it's in one of the top 5 pest species internationally. So it's problematic elsewhere in the world. Here in Australia, it's endemic. And in Tasmania, the temperate species, which is shown to be pretty high in the required chemical, the bromoforms, is it does really well. So, and we have, at the moment, we're the only ones, there's a little bit in South Australia now is kicked off, but the Tassie was first prime mover on getting things in the water. We have an amazing array of kelps that we know will fit into the market. And we have an introduced species, Undaria wakami, which I think Paul might talk to later, that is established here. Nowhere else in Australia is it currently established. So it's probably the only place we have the potential to do anything with Undaria, at least without taking into account that serious biosecurity risks. And we have significant capability through the companies here and through the interest of the government in processing and value adding. And in that, processing and value adding is, as John said, hugely important in terms of what is the production that we can get out at the other end. But one of the big things we need to nail in a lot of these products is product stabilization as it comes out of the growing cycle. Because in some of these, this is what really needs to be, and it's not nailed. It's a question still to be dealt with for a lot of our products, is ensuring the quality that goes into the processing. And we've done a bit of work here in UTAS, setting it up with some specialist dehydration and drying facilities. And I know Paul and Marinova have done a lot of work in this space, but it's something the government has backed and is really keen to get involved with. So it's a real opportunity for Tasmania. As is we have significant work around carbon mitigation and restoration in the research teams here. that we would love to be able to bring to this particular challenge in order to ensure that those environmental positives in terms of nutrient and carbon management. The other one that I've just tapped in is, again, sorry for the focus on seaweed, but it is really one of the big opportunities that this industry has to exploit. The Australian Sustainable Seaweed Alliance has managed to secure a promise of investment from the federal government of $8 million for a national hatchery network. And ourselves in Tasmania and UTAS indeed, and South Australia are the prime movers on that to actually set that up, to provide the skills, the science understanding and the training that will feed out to networks of hatcheries around Australia to get this bioproducts industry moving. The last one I just wanted to touch on is really where it comes from me, is that if the industry is to be successful, it needs to be informed, it needs to be multidisciplinary, and it needs to take an ethical approach to production and development. I think we're well set up in Tasmania to support that. We have a small community of very connected scientists, researchers, and industry professionals, and we need to really try to work together, not just here, but also as we work with partners nationally. You've probably all heard of the triple bottom line, which is, ensuring that it's sustainably, economically in the profit margin, sustainably socially with people, and sustainably environmentally with the planet. But these days, much more focus is on the quadruple bottom line, which means that your underlying purpose for why you're doing it, your ethical position, is sustainable. And I think that's what this new bioproducts industry needs to have and can have in spades, and Tassie in particular can support it if we work collectively on that. So that's the end of the main part of what I wanted to say about what I think are the opportunities and risks in terms of this in Tasmania, particularly the opportunities. I think there's huge opportunities, and the risks can be managed if we work collectively. The other one I just wanted to flag, and I'm on the organizing committee for this, and they'd kill me if I didn't put it up. But if you're more interested in the details around some of the opportunities coming out of Australia in terms of the seaweed, the International Seaweed Symposium is being hosted here in Tasmania in February next year. And we hope to have significant amounts of research outputs to be able to connect people into at that point. And that's me. Do you want me to pass on to Paul? So yeah, as I said, I didn't mention a lot about the pharmaceutical, nutraceutical, cosmeceutical, because I think Paul is way better positioned to talk to that than I am. Thank you.
I'm going to take a bit more. Thank you. That's good. Thank you. Katrina, thank you. And thank you, obviously, to the Royal Society of Tasmania and the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering for the opportunity to present here this evening. I must say that when I was preparing this presentation, I started to ponder whether we might actually be creating some history here this evening. I may be wrong, but this could be the first occasion that a chartered accountant has ever been asked to present to an audience of scientists and engineers and like-minded people. So could be a recipe for disaster, but let's see how we go. So over the next 15 minutes, I'll try and abandon the accountant stereotype. We'll try and keep it as interesting and informative as possible. So the course of this presentation, I'll provide an overview of Marinova, where we've come from biotech startup through to our position now as a recognised global leader in a particular niche, and where we're heading, and also how we fit into the CRC and how the CRC also fits into Marinova's plans for the future. Before we get going, I do want to address a potential elephant in the room and apologise in advance. I do have a somewhat persistent cough. I can assure you it's not COVID related, but I do apologise in advance if that does detract somewhat from the presentation. Anyway, so an overview around Marinova. We're a biotech company. We are Hobart-based, Tasmanian-owned, privately owned, incorporated in 2003. So we actually celebrate our 20th birthday next year. Over that course of 19 or 20 years, we have established ourselves as the global leader in the science and the manufacture of this particular compound called fucoidan. I'll tell you a little bit more about what fucoidan is and what fucoidan does in a moment. But suffice to say, Marinova is a very unique biotech company in the sense that we have these vertically integrated operations that span seaweed harvest right through to the manufacture of very high purity seaweed extracts for nutritional, skin care and potentially pharmaceutical applications. Importantly, and as Katrina mentioned there, sustainability extends to being financially sustainable, and Marinova is fortunate to have worked its way into a position to be a financially stable and successful enterprise, and part of that is around our focus on producing products that actually meet a market need. And we're currently in a position where we're exporting to over 35 countries. So what is this compound called fucoidan? Put simply, it's the slimy substance that's exuded from the cell wall of seaweed. So if you pick up a piece of seaweed on the beach and you feel that slimy film on the outside, that is ostensibly fucoidan. It's a highly bioactive complex polysaccharide. It's a carbohydrate molecule or sugar molecule. I can assure you it doesn't taste like table sugar. It's a long way removed from that. It's characterised by being a very high molecular weight compound. Interestingly, it's really only found, there are two sources for fucoidan. Brown seaweeds. Seaweeds are largely classified as either browns, greens or reds. It's only found in brown seaweeds. The only other source of fucoidan is actually in echinoderms, which are the sea cucumbers. It was first isolated more than a century ago at Uppsala University in Sweden, of all places. And since that time, there have been more than 2,500 papers published on the bioactivity of fucoidan. It's important to note that there's not just one fucoidan out there. Each brown seaweed species yields a very distinct and discrete fucoidan. So it's very much species dependent. A fucoidan derived from the Undaria species of seaweed will have profoundly different bioactivities from a fucoidan derived from another, say, Northern Hemisphere species of seaweed. Fucoidan occurs naturally in very low concentrations in the plant, and to put that into context, some of our high purity fucoidan compounds that we manufacture and sell to pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, can take up to 300 or 400 kilograms of fresh seaweed to produce just 1 kilogram of high purity fucoidan. So why are we interested in this compound called fucoidan? Well, aside from these powerful bioactivities, and we've listed some of the main ones there, it's a natural compound that also has the potential to be developed into high purity characterised compounds for pharmaceutical and medical device applications. In terms of some of the work that Marinova has done, we have there half a dozen of the sort of key areas, health indications that we have looked at. We've conducted clinical trials on osteoarthritis. In terms of digestive and gastric health, we've undertaken studies here at the University of Tasmania, showing the potential for our fucoidan to address ulcerative colitis, immune function, stem cell mobilisation. We've shown that our fucoidan also has a range, can modulate a range of key biomarkers of immunity. Fucoidan is very well known for its viral inhibitory properties, and we've shown that our fucoidan again has this inhibitory property against a whole range of coated viruses, including flu viruses and herpes viruses. Notwithstanding that fucoidan was first isolated more than 100 years ago, a vast majority of the research on this compound has actually taken place in just the last 25 years. That gives you some idea of the rapidly increasing scientific interest in this compound. So why Tasmania, and how did this all come about? Look, although we extract fucoidans from several different species of seaweeds, the evolution of Marinova has been intrinsically linked to one particular species, and that's the species that Katrina mentioned, Undaria pinnatifida, or wakame seaweed. This is the seaweed, for those who like Japanese cuisine, that's floating in your miso soup. So it's actually one of the most widely consumed seaweeds globally. The species was introduced into Tasmanian waters about 40 years ago through the bilge water of visiting vessels. Moored off Triabunna, filling up with wood chips, discharging their bilge water, and within that bilge water, sporophytes from the Undaria plants from Korea, Japan, dissipated throughout the Mercury Passage and started to proliferate through the east coast or down the east coast of Tasmania. Interestingly, Undaria was introduced unintentionally into the waters of New Zealand and Argentina at about that same time. And like Australia, those countries have also classified Undaria as a noxious pest. So whether it's a culinary delight or raw material for therapeutic applications or a noxious pest is very much depends on your point of view, but suffice to say that Marinova was founded on a desire to utilise this invasive pest for the betterment of human health. Central to Marinova's success has been a very unique extraction process, a proprietary extraction process that we have developed and refined over the evolution of the company, and we still continue to refine this extraction process. We've trademarked it the Maritech extraction process. Unlike most traditional extraction processes, fucoidan that utilise solvents, organic solvents like ethanol to precipitate the fucoidan out of the seaweed plant, our unique process is an aqueous process. There are no solvents involved. There are a number of advantages by having a solvent-free process like this. It actually enables us to enhance or maximise the bioactivity of the compound. So we're actually producing fucoidan compounds that are unrivaled in terms of their quality and their efficacy, and also in terms of their applicability to go into high-end medical device and potentially pharmaceutical applications. The Maritech process also enables us to obtain global regulatory acceptance for our compounds, and to this point in time, Marinova is still the only company that has European novel foods acceptance for its fucoidan compounds in the European market. And again, that's all attributable back to this technology that we have developed and applied through our manufacturing process. And as I said, it gives us the opportunity to customise these very highly refined, characterised compounds for pharmaceutical and medical research as well. So the sustainability agenda, it goes to the heart of the Marinova ethos. Throughout all facets of our business, sustainability is evident, ranging from zero waste, from the cusp of being a zero waste manufacturer. All of our seaweed byproducts, solid byproduct, ends up in a commercial horticultural product. Our liquid byproducts are now being concentrated and also going into horticultural products. Nothing's going back into landfill. As I say, no nasty solvents are involved in the extraction process. We're very fortunate, obviously, here in Tasmania with our reliance on hydroelectricity. On top of that, Marinova's installed a very significant solar array, so we are fully reliant upon renewable energy. And then, of course, we're dealing with a pest species primarily here, and it's a nice story to be able to turn a pest species into something that potentially sells for up to $12,000 a kilogram. So it's a rapidly renewable resource, and we're very fortunate in many ways to be able to have this pest species here in Tasmania and to be able to utilise it for not just the betterment of human health, but also for the betterment of the Tasmanian and Australian economy. In terms of our research and our product development focus, look, at any point in time, we have between 20 and 25 active product development and research projects underway. Specific details of those are commercial in confidence, but what we can say is, you can see there some of the leading areas that we're focusing on at the moment. And I must say, a significant proportion of this research to date has actually been undertaken here at the University of Tasmania. But we do adopt the process or the attitude towards finding the best researchers, wherever they may be, whether it's in Australia, overseas, find the experts in their field to assist us with our research program and enable us to target these particular health indications and refine our R&D program. So in terms of Marinova's involvement in the Marine Bioproducts CRC, what it means to us. First of all, Marinova is a core industry partner in the CRC, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, I think we may be the largest Tasmanian industry partner contributing to the CRC. Our participation in the CRC is going to fast track about $5 million worth of research into our fucoidan extracts over the coming years. Without the CRC, yes, that research would have taken place over a longer period. It's giving us the opportunity to commercialise more products, develop more products, commercialise them, bring forward our whole pipeline. There are 2 projects that have already been approved by the CRC and are about to commence. The first of those is a human clinical trial, which is going to be conducted at Griffith University, investigating a condition called eosinophilic esophagitis. It's a debilitating chronic immune condition of the esophagus. We've already conducted pilot scale studies at Griffith University, shown that our particular fucoidan in a particular gel formulation can attenuate this debilitating condition. So one of the first projects through the CRC is actually going to be conduct a larger scale clinical study up in Queensland looking at this particular condition. The other very major project that we're about to embark upon will be conducted here at the University of Tasmania through the School of Pharmacy. And I know Associate Professor Nuri Gervin is here. He'll be leading that particular project, and that project is going to be looking at the ability of Marinova's fucoidan compounds to address ageing and accelerated ageing related processes. So it's cellular senescence research. So it's a 2 to 3 year stage project, but we're expecting some very exciting results to come out of that particular project. In terms of Marinova's strategic advantages, look, these again have evolved as the company has evolved, and our success has largely been dependent upon our ability to leverage these strategic advantages. We've become the leader in fucoidan science and the manufacture of fucoidan science really by virtue of our novel extraction process. It's our sustained investment in R&D. And there are a range of other proprietary and intangible attributes, including a whole network of accreditations that we have achieved, that we leverage and have set us apart from the competition in this space. And you can see there, the zero waste and sustainability message is very important, not just to us and our ethos, but also to a majority of our customers. When you're talking about customers in the skincare space, pharmaceutical space, the nutritional space, they are increasingly demanding upon their suppliers of ingredients like Marinova. They want to know about the commitments that are being made at that ingredient level to sustainability. Look, I'm often asked about our recipe for success. This is not the recipe for success, it's a recipe for success, particularly in circumstances where less than 25% of biotech companies in Australia will ever evolve into a financially sustainable business. Unfortunately, the attrition rate for biotechnology in Australia is very low, and there are a number of reasons for that. We're very pragmatic in terms of our approach to research and development, but we do say one of the key sayings we have around the office at Marinova is, let's just stick to our knitting and keep it simple. We need to know what our core competencies are, recognise what they are, and don't deviate from those core competencies. And, you know, that's been, again, a key pillar to the evolution of the company over 20 years, not deviating from those core competencies. So we have we're in the business-to-business space. There are no Marinova branded products on any pharmacy shelves. We just manufacture these compounds in bulk and sell them to the nutritional, pharmaceutical and skincare companies. Yes, there have been opportunities for us to commercialise and get into the business-to-consumer market. That's not our core competency. That opens up a whole new range of credentials and skills that are needed to get into that space. That's not what we're about. And we always say that quality will always trump price. And Marinova is not about becoming the biggest fucoidan producer in the world. We're about being the best fucoidan producer in the world and having the capabilities that no one else in the world has. And we also recognise, being in Australia, costs of production are significantly higher, obviously, than many other parts of the world. We recognise that. We accept that. But reflecting that through our business model, about investing in research and development, adding to that value proposition of our products. The first point there, which I've neglected, and it's probably the most important point, is about attracting exceptional people to the organisation and retaining exceptional people to our organisation. About 70% of our team were actually born overseas or recruited from overseas. So we've got staff from the US, Denmark, South Africa, Korea, the UK, Philippines, Malaysia. And these staff bring levels of expertise and worldliness that can often be challenging for small companies like Marinova to find in a domestic job market. We're always leveraging those key strategic advantages I talked about in the previous slide there, and the sustained investment in commercially focused R&D. We don't undertake science for the sake of science. All of our science is targeted to try and achieve a commercial outcome. We do invest, as John mentioned, between 20 and 25% of our gross revenues every year into research and development. Put that in perspective, and I know we're comparing apples to oranges here, but if you take CSL, the biggest biotech pharmaceutical company, and actually the largest company in Australia at the moment, very successful, they invest about 9% of their gross revenues back into research and development. Marinova is several orders of magnitude smaller than CSL, but as a proportion of our gross revenues, we're investing more than double what a huge corporation like CSL does back into commercially focused research and development. In terms of the future, look, there are enormous research and market opportunities available to us. In terms of those research opportunities, a lot of those are now going to be intertwined with the MBCRC. And as I say, that's going to help facilitate and bring forward some very key research programs and projects over the coming years. And we also have a major capital expansion underway at our facility here in Tasmania. That expansion will be taking place over the next 2 to 3 years. It will enable us to triple our production capacity. And whilst we aren't quite at the point where we have bottlenecks in our production process, we're fortunate enough to be in a position now to prepare us for what we expect will be a further uptick in demand for our products over the coming years. So we have that major capital expansion taking place. Part of that will be, significant new technologies that we're going to be bringing into the company. They'll be commissioned over the next 18 months to 2 years. That will hopefully achieve more efficiencies in our extraction process, create more opportunities for us to produce even more refined fucoidan compounds. It will also enable us to obtain greater supply chain security. And as we all know, over the last 2.5 years with supply chains and interruptions to supply chains, it's important that, inventory is managed carefully, and the old adage and the emphasis on just in time inventory management has long since flown out the window. And businesses have to adapt to that. So as part of this capital expansion, we're going to be increasing our warehousing and inventory storage capabilities. And look, in summary, it's about consolidating our global leadership position from the back blocks of Cambridge in Hobart. It's about leveraging those strategic advantages, continuing that commitment to research and development, continuing to attract exceptional people into the organisation, yeah, just continuing the path that we've been on for the last 19 years. Thank you.
Well, that's the presentations done. I think we can get the speakers to come up. Can we all have our microphones on the same time? Oh, very sophisticated. And we're going to try and get Justin, if we can, to appear from somewhere. Do I have to turn this off? Or can you do that, Angus? Justin, hopefully.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, you are big, Justin.
You are very big.
So, sorry, we're sitting down, but Justin, we've just finished the presentations, as I hope you could see from Adelaide, and I'm going to open the floor up for questions now. Both, I've got the technology apparently to look for Q&A from the. Yep. So anybody in the virtual audience can type a question into the Q&A panel, and I'll keep an eye on it, and we can put them to the panel too. So amongst the Tasmanian crowd here, have you got any questions or comments on what you've heard today? Perhaps you could identify yourself too, just so we can keep it for the recording.
Hi, I'm Paul Donoghue. I'm a physical organic chemist, so I'm not a marine person. Question to Paul and Katrina. Interesting stuff. My questions are two things about impact and sustainability, given that you're using a natural resource, and my understanding is that the waters around Tasmania are changing faster than almost anywhere. So your seaweed and your general environment is going to change quite quickly. So are you confident that you can go forward with your plans in light of the environmental changes which we are experiencing?
Would you like me to address that from a commercial perspective? Yes. Look, thank you. Certainly, in terms of, as I explained, Marinova is extracting fucoidan from several species of seaweed. Here in Tasmania, we have a harvest of the Undaria pinnatifida species. We have actually seen over the last 15 years a decline in the prevalence of that species on the east coast of Tasmania. It's for that reason that we have actually excuse me, established a subsidiary company in Argentina, which is one of the only other countries where there is, quality Undaria growing in southern Patagonia as a redundancy of supply. Should what we consider to be a resource here in Tasmania continue to decline. So from a commercial perspective, we're always taking those sorts of factors into account. I shouldn't say planning for a worst case scenario. We're very pragmatic about the potential for that. And, we've seen obviously with the macrocystis, the kelp forest here, and what can happen in a very short period of time.
Yeah. Is mine on? Yep. No. But I turned it on. How's that? That's much better. Okay. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And it's definitely something sort of from the Programme 1 perspective in the MBCRC, which is bioproduct production. We have what we're calling a production toolbox. And one of the things that is really important to us in there is it the right species? Is it the right site? And in amongst that will be the longevity. And we all know climate change has is going to be a major issue to a lot of our coastal ecosystems. There's two ways you can handle it. You can make sure in the first place you're picking a species that does have that longevity. So many of the species that we're actually looking at in terms of the kelps are ones that are on the in the mainland coasts of Australia. So it'll hopefully be relevant for a good bit longer. but there's also the potential to breed that resilience into the stocks that you're dealing with. But again, alongside that comes some very interesting risks around if you're breeding it into the stocks, are you creating stocks that are going to be long-term in an area they shouldn't be? But it's another area where we find, even in UTAS, this is really important. There's been a lot of overlap between the research teams that are working in this space, in the aquaculture and the commercial development side, and the researchers who are working in the ecosystem sustainability side. So some of the work that's being, Macrocystis, the giant kelp, is one of the species we're very interested in. And the crossover is between looking at it from a commercial production sense and looking at it from the point of view of sustaining that community in the environment as the environment changes. The conservation agenda are very close. So yeah, it's one yet to be certain on, but it's one that we have to be really mindful of as we go forward into this. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay.
Any other questions? Ross, we'll just get a microphone so the people in line can hear.
Hi, Ross Large from University of Tasmania. I think you mentioned, Katrina, that the amount of nutrients in the Southern Ocean was a lot less than the Northern Ocean. Can you explain which particular nutrients you're talking about, and why do you think the Southern Oceans are depleted compared to the North?
So it may not necessarily be the Southern Oceans as such, because actually when you get down to those cool waters, it gets a little bit better. It's the nitrogen really that we're looking at and talking about there. But around Australia, particularly as the water gets warmer, you get less nutrients. So the influence of the East Australian current means that we have less of that available. It can be quite challenging, but it also presents an opportunity, which is one of the reasons why we've been looking at things like growing some of these seaweeds in association with elevated anthropogenic and man-made nutrient sources, such as the fish farms or so, you know, we all know the Blackman's Bay Macrocystis stance grows really well because it's pretty close to Blackman's Bay sewage treatment plant, or was. But you can put it alongside, there's a company that's dealing with effluent from one of the largest wheat and flour producers. They're actually utilizing that effluent to enhance the production of the seaweed. And that's the clever partnerships that we're going to have to make. Or we look at different harvest strategies. You may not get the densities that you might get in the Northern Hemisphere, but you spread it over a bigger area. But it's definitely something that producers have to bear in mind, that not every location will be the same. It might look great in terms of a shore base and the seaweeds are there, but they might not have the same production potential. And you just have to manage for that.
Other parts of Australia don't have that problem as well. So it's one of the reasons for spreading your bets in terms of the whole of the continent.
And some seaweeds are better able, well, we're talking seaweeds, but if you may look at different species, but some seaweeds are better suited to low nutrient growth than others. So picking the market and the species matching it to that as well.
A company that we all know pretty well in this town, Tassal, is a partner in the CRC, not for their salmon aquaculture, but because they've branched out. And those of you who bought prawns from the Tassal shop for Christmas, they're very heavily into growing prawns on the Queensland coast. Queensland coast prawn farms have struggled to meet the environmental regulations that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority puts on them, that the water coming out of a prawn farm, where you're growing literally thousands of tons of prawns, feeding them, having their excrement and the like, the water going out of a farm has to be better than the water that's coming into the farm. And so prawn farmers have struggled for 30 odd years that I know about to try to meet those conditions and to be profitable. We got the call, in fact, Katrina tipped us, we got the call from Tassal that, can you grow seaweeds in those effluent ponds that we would settle out the prawn poo in? And yes, you can. And what would that likely be able to produce seaweed that was valuable as a source, biomass source for production? Yes, it would. And I think this year they produced a number of thousands of tonnes of seaweed in a prawn farm and met their environmental regulations as a result of doing it.
Yes.
So you'll see, I can absolutely predict, and I think Mark Ryan is already buying up prawn releases up and down the coast. You'll see that as a model for producing seaweeds in Queensland and probably Western Australia and Northern Territory, where they're pulling very, very large numbers of prawn production figures together over the next 10 years. We'll see seaweeds growing in the effluent of prawn farms. And I think you'll see the same in a range of other habitats too, where the synergistic effects add up for profits on both sides of the primary production and the secondary production.
But I think the other really important one there too is the one that you alluded to, Paul, is that what is the production you're looking for? Is it quantity or quality? So maybe some of this might be steering us towards, well, you know, we're not necessarily looking for massive quantities, we're looking for high quality product.
And one of the opportunities for, you know, potential cultivation of seaweeds from Marinova's perspective is it enables, at the moment, we engage commercial divers who actually have to go swimming around to find the plants of the right age, of the right size to meet our specifications. There are a whole range of implications around that, mainly cost implications. The opportunity exists with the cultivation of seaweeds to create batches of seaweed that all mature at the same time to enable the harvesting and creating a resource for companies like Marinova that better meet our requirements.
I was wondering whether we did have a virtual audience, but we do. And Anna Brooks has asked a question. I think it's probably one for you, Katrina. I note that all three talks show images of giant kelp, Macrocystis. In what ways will this species be used? I note that the species has declined markedly along Tasmania's east coast over recent years.
Yep, I can answer that a little bit. So the Seaweed Solutions CRCP project that we looked at growing seaweeds alongside other aquaculture species, the three species we looked at were Lawsonia, Ecklonia, and Macrocystis. And so Macrocystis has a product potential in domestic and international markets. But also one of the things that we found in doing that was we learned an awful lot about growing Macrocystis. So not only were we able to consider it as a commercial proposition, but in actual fact, we've been providing the surplus hatchery stock is what we call green gravel for seeding into conservation projects. And we've been working quite closely with the teams down at Eagle Hawk Neck. It's gone down there, but also the teams in IMAS who are looking very much at that restoration agenda around improving the Macrocystis around Tasmania. That was how they tie together. The question was, are they valuable as a product? Was that in there as part of the question? If
in
so,
what ways will the species be used was the question, probably answered.
So again, there's interest in Macrocystis both as a food production and as additives into a range of bioproducts, a whole range that we're still actually looking at what the potential is in there.
And Marinova has actually already has conducted quite a bit of research on fucoidans out of Macrocystis, obviously not Tasmanian grown Macrocystis. And we've shown there's some very unique bioactivities out of that unique fucoidan out of Macrocystis. So if we ever get to the point where we are commercially growing or farming Macrocystis in Tasmania, there will be ready markets for it.
Yep. And it is one of the species that lends itself quite nicely to aquaculture production. So far, we've got to nail a few things, but it's one that definitely shows potential.
That answers the second part of the question was if it's in decline in eastern Tasmania, are we ever going to be able to grow it?
Yeah, no, it's definitely one. We're hoping to have field manuals for those three species available by the time we get to the Seaweed Conference, so by the end of this year. Still a lot to learn. Don't get me wrong, this is not something that's going to come out and we've done it all. There's a lot to learn, but it's certainly definitely viable.
Got a couple of minutes left. Are there any further questions? There was a thank you from Anna Brooks, by the way. Ross, you need the microphone again for people to hear. I'm
interested in nutrients again. My reason for that is that I've been studying the variation in nutrients in the ocean through time,
Yep.
going back hundreds of millions of years, and there's great variations that we can see. And that's particularly the micronutrients like molybdenum and selenium and
Yep.
cobalt. Do you worry about these nutrients, and do they affect the growth of any of the species that you're dealing with?
So the answer to that is probably yes, we will be, but the problems they're facing right now are more fundamental. So I think at the moment, once we get over the basics of being able to grow the species, and we've got some certainty in that, comes the phase that we start moving into refinement. And what are those micronutrients, and how does that add to either product potential or your growth strategies? But at this stage, the industry in terms of aquaculture of seaweeds is so new that they're trying to get over the basic hurdles of, you know, can we get it in? Will it stay on the lines we put it in? And when we take it out, is it any good? But they'll definitely be down the track. And I know it's something that's of interest in some of the microalgal production because they're a little bit more refined because a lot of it's on land. But no, that's an area, Ross, that still needs a lot more exploration, and we will get to that refinement. We're not that far away to start having to understand what the subtleties of growth and growth requirements are. They certainly have a better understanding, and that's one of the things, sorry, John, I mentioned earlier. A lot of our capability in the science space for this is not coming from people with the specific aquaculture experience. It's coming from the physiologists and the ecologists. And so they have it in the sense of differentiation in the natural world, but it's translating that into the culture environment. So yeah, watch this space. I think that one will be the next sort of issues we'll start to look at.
Just before you, John, with some trepidation, Justin, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you want to cough before I do? And poor guy. So I think one of the recurrent themes in today was the potential for Australia to play on the international stage, and you've been through startups and you've been through this sort of the valley of death and the like. What do you think are potential niches or competitive advantages that people on this market? Obviously, if you produce the world's best product, you're going to win in the quality market. What's the advantage that Australia will have if we get this up and running in a big way in say, Asian markets that are probably the thirstiest at the moment in terms of their appetite?
Thanks, John. Now I'm going to try very hard not to cough directly into a live mic here, but I think in some ways the Marinova story is, I think, almost the archetype of what we want to have more of going forward. I don't think, given Australia is an advanced economy, I don't think we should be trying to compete down on price really at all. So I think the idea of competing on quality, also the idea of competing on that upfront investment in R&D. I think Paul's done a brilliant job with Marinova on that front, and you can see the benefits of having a heavy investment in R&D, and that plays to a big part of Australia's strengths. We are very good at researching R&D generally here in Australia. What we are a little bit worse at is that idea of translation into industry, and obviously that's where organisations like the CRC are going to be instrumental in trying to mature that industry that we've got. The other thing, of course, is the natural advantage that we have here in Australia, and your early slide, John, will clearly demonstrated that, in that we've got such a broad biome to draw from, and it draws on different environments, different species of seaweed, and as Katrina said, a lot of these things are quite specific to certain areas or certain species of seaweed. So I think having that very broad biome, strong investment in R&D, and having sort of medium-sized companies focused on quality, I think will be the big things that will really move Australia forward.
Perhaps one additional thing, when we were putting our bid together, for those of you who've been in CRCs, you'll know the feeling. You're madly trying to get everything wrapped up in terms of partners and the proposal and the like. And we had 3 of our biggest investors were Chinese companies that we thought were pretty good because they didn't actually want to take anything out of Australia in terms of IP. They weren't going to grow anything or produce anything. They were marketing companies. They were two of China's biggest pharmaceutical, nutraceutical, cosmeceutical companies. And of course, Blackmores and a couple of other companies in Australia that we think are Australian or Chinese as well. They were big investors because they saw the advantage of having, and they wanted an exclusive right to buy products from the CRC partners of clean and green and certified Australian products. That the value add for them in terms of sales and sale prices was worth them investing literally tens of millions of dollars in the CRC to get it. And then our Prime Minister said something about COVID, and all three partners have left the CRC before our bid went into the government. Luckily, the panel still were convinced that we had a strong case. John.
John Volkman, formerly of CSIRO, now happily retired. We've heard a lot about macroalgae, but the word microalgae has just cropped up once or twice, and I just wonder what you're planning in that space, because microalgae are a wonderful source of all sorts of bioproducts, polyunsaturated fatty acids, bioceuticals.
Yeah, we just showed the bias of one member of our.
You did ask Tassie, yeah, but it's
John, we've got more microalgae growing companies investing in the CRC than we have macroalgae, and they all have a wellhead of potential compounds and markets for it. Interestingly, they're struggling to get the level of cash that the ones that say they've got a methane busting algae on tap are getting, but they're probably more mature companies than the macroalgae farmers are at the moment. So they're front and centre. We've got Peter Ralph's team as a member of the CRC, and Wei Zhang, our research director, has worked for years on microalgal compounds as well. So yes, it was just a slight bias given that we've
and is biofuels part of your remit or not?
So we were told in no uncertain terms that the Australian government wasn't interested in biofuels 3.5 years ago when we first started talking about the bid. And so we didn't write it anywhere in our proposal. We have Ben Kimmer, who you may know from UQ, who's a disciple of biofuels. He has a list as long as his arm of people who would like to invest in biofuels. We don't have the money to do it through the CRC funds, but it's an example of, we'd like this to be the kernel, if you like, in building a lot of these industries based on microalgae, macroalgae, and a range of other primary producers, or biomass, as I learnt to say. Biologists didn't know what biomass thought. We thought biomass was the number of fish in a stock, but biomass for a chemist is just the stuff you put in the processing factory and the like. So biomass in our CRC now, we believe, can go to whatever we think Australia will benefit from. So I'd imagine there'll be some biofuels companies investing through us in short order.
And there's definitely there's quite a difference in where as John said, where the microalgal companies are, and yes, they're mainly on the mainland and particularly in Northern Australia at the moment. But I think once they get a few rungs on the board, you will see that develop much more.
The two companies that I'd most likely like to really get a spurt on are both in the final stage of clearances of nine-figure investments from the US at the moment. So, and I'd say their chances have gone up, rocketed up over the last 12 months with a whole range of things in the climate space happening. I'm conscious that we cancelled the drinks because we didn't think there were enough of you to keep drinks on after the event. So I apologise for that. We were going to have a one-on-one discussions with anybody who wanted to stick around. But I think I will close it off, especially for the people online. We've enjoyed having you as an audience and the questions. We're not going to go anywhere. We all live in Hobart. If you'd like to contact us or come and work with us, if you like, if you're interested, please make contact. I've got some cards from the CRC that you a first contact, and I'm very happy to point you towards other program leaders and to Justin if you'd like to make contact. I think that'll close the talking heads part of the show.
So the last thing we need to do is actually thank our speakers and really a very enlightening session, bringing the audience up to date on this very new area in bioproductivity from the oceans and the role being played by both the researchers and the commercial enterprises here in Tasmania. So I just have a small gift, one for each of you. Thank you.
One of those famous pieces of artwork? No,
No,
oh, that's a pity.
John?
Oh, thank you very much.
One of our publications from the Royal Society.
Oh, lovely. Oh, beautiful.
Oh, thank you, Jocelyn. Really appreciate it.
We also have one for Justin, but that's going to have to get to him another way.
Oh, yeah.
And also for you, Paul. So please join me now in thanking our speakers for their presentations.
And it would be remiss of me not to thank Jocelyn. I think we ticked over 100 emails in the last 2 days. You are an absolute force when it comes to organising these things. Thank you to RST. It was a pleasure working with you again this year, and we have to do it again 12 months time. Not on Festival of Voices, and perhaps not even in the middle of winter next time. We might get a better audience. Thank you.
Pleasure, and thank you all for coming. Online audience as well as the in-person audience. Very much appreciated to have your company tonight. I'd also like to thank our Royal Society volunteers who helped outside and inside this evening, and thank UTAS and our AV supporter Angus for keeping everything on track. And also we've actually got an ATSI supporter as well who's been behind the scenes with the online production, Esrina. So thank you to Angus and Esrina as well. So we'll end the session now. If you do have more discussion you want to follow up with Paul or Katrina or John, I'm not sure if Justin will remain accessible. Perhaps he will. Please take advantage of this opportunity. Sadly, without alcohol, but nevertheless, it's an opportunity. Yes, an opportunity. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.